wanted just to put a little bit of context around this presentation. We were talking all these months about discerning the way forward for Holy Comforter, and the Pathfinders kept using the phrase, how do we discern God's invitation, God's will for us in these changing times? Let's start, Vicki, with a prayer. O God of unchangeable power and eternal light, look favorably on your whole church, that wonderful and sacred mystery. By the effectual working of your providence, carry out in tranquility the plan of salvation. Let the whole world see and know that things which were being cast down are being raised up, and things which had grown old are being made new, and that all things are being brought to their perfection by him through whom all things were made. Your Son, Jesus Christ, our Lord, who lives and reigns with you in the unity of the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever. Amen. So keep that image, if you will, of this notion of things being cast down and raised up. That's sort of a central theme, right? We're in the midst of the Great 50 Days, where that's our theme for sure, but also the theme of our religion. So before we begin, I wanted to see who's in our studio audience today. That dates me, right, to talk about a studio audience. Let me ask you, I'm going to ask you to do something that my grandmother and my mother told me never to do, which is ask women to tell me their ages. But it'll be painless. If you were born before or up to 1964, please raise your hands. Okay, take a good look at that, if you will. All right? If you were born between 1965 and 1980, raise your hands. Very interesting. Okay, is there anyone here born after 1980? Yes. All right, excellent. Do you want to tell us what year?
1990.
1990. Okay, so that's a really quick, if we were to graph what we just did, you would see what? That the preponderance of Episcopalians are 59 or older, or just plain old. That's right. They all look like me. They all have hair the same color of mine. We have very, very few in that category of, you would be a millennial, I guess, born in 1990. Generational issues are very important, and I kind of do that just to sort of dramatically emphasize. This is a tiny little sort of example. If we were graphed the Episcopal Church, this would be what we would see, very typically. Okay, next slide. So Phyllis Tickle, some of you have read her. She's a great writer of spiritual essays, and she's deceased now, a great lover as well as a critic of the church. And she coined this saying that every 500 years or so, the church cleans out its attic and has a rummage sale. And that's where we've been for a while, where we decide what is so precious to us that we need to hold fast to that. And what are some things that we need to let loose? If you think about what Jesus said in that gospel today, when Jesus arrived in that locked room, he said, those things that you will hold fast will be held fast, those things will be loosed, shall be loosed. I think it's so interesting. His first appearance after the resurrection was to tell the disciples, you need to be careful about what you hold on to and what you release. And that's an important thing for us as Episcopalians, because let's just be honest with each other, brothers and sisters, right? Change is not something we take too easily in the Episcopal Church. I usually tell people things change in the Episcopal Church at the speed of a glacier, right? And you know that old joke, right? How many Episcopalians does it take to change a light bulb? Change? My grandmother gave us that light bulb. We can't change that. So we're kind of change averse. But right now we're in a period of time where the church is having a rummage sale. So when was the last big one of these? The last one, of course, was the Reformation, right? Where many of us our tradition split from the Roman Catholic tradition and began to have Reformed traditions that talked about the church. And we made lots of decisions back then about who was going to be in charge, what the authority structure would be. Two of the most important things for me during that rummage sale was that we decided that we need to worship in the vernacular, in the language of the people. And we came up with this idea of via media, that the Episcopal, the Anglican tradition was a place where people could meet in worship, even if they disagreed about every other thing in their lives. As we worship, so we believe, we say, and that was an important thing. So you're welcome in this big tent of the Episcopal Church, and we come together and worship. That's what we can agree on, and the rest of it we're going to work out together. Also, we agreed that we could have direct access to Jesus. I was raised a Roman Catholic, and I have a whole cadre of saints I call on. Everything from St. Patrick's for green lights, and St. Anthony for lost objects. But the Reformation was about how we can have access directly to God. We don't need to go through intermediaries, including priests and bishops and deacons. And of course, we came up with the wonderful resource we have, the Book of Common Prayer. So that was our last big rummage sale, but this rummage sale has been going on for quite a while. If you think about the second half of the 20th century up until today, what were the big issues that were impacting not only the church, but the culture? What were some of those big issues?
Ordination of women.
Ordination of women. John, my brother, excellent. A very good idea. All agreed?
Gay people.
Ordination of people who are gay, lesbian, trans, those kinds of things. What else? Same-sex marriage, certainly. I graduated in 2004 from seminary, right after we welcomed Bishop Gene Robinson into his position as bishop. Very hard time, very hard on the church and the culture. What else? Racism, civil rights issues, and now we're confronting the legacy of systemic racism that we have to grapple with in our country and really around the world. What else?
Involvement of other cultures, people of other cultures, people of other languages.
Yep, the diversity and the multiculturalism that's now part of daily life for a lot of people. That's right. What's another big issue that we dealt with through the second half of the 20th century into the very important one, right into the present?
Income inequality.
Income inequality, absolutely. Economics are a big issue. I'm talking about corruption in the church. I'm talking about the abuse of children, the abuse of women, the abuse of people by the church. Whether it's the Roman Church or the Baptist Church, or with all due respect, the Episcopal Church as well, that has shattered the confidence in a lot of people's minds about the church as an institution. All right, so there's lots of things that have impacted the culture that are now making their way into the church. I see right now we're recording this. 5 years ago, this would not be happening, would it? Not be important. I looked up at the back of the church, and you have cameras and other things in the back of the church where you record the service. That's not something that was even thought of. That was anathema, if you will, 5 years ago. So there are lots and lots of things, go to the next slide, in the context and culture that are the waters that we're swimming in today. And here are a couple we want to talk about. Technology, first and foremost. Technology has influenced every single aspect of our lives. I can remember being the first person in my family to get a microwave oven. And I was out of college 3 years when that happened, right? Do you remember those huge cell phones? I can remember seeing someone walking down the streets in Chicago with this huge thing in his ear thinking, how pretentious. I will never do anything like that. And now my phone is in that bag. It's never more than 10 feet away from me, right? So the speed of information, the sources of information, and their credibility have changed dramatically. We have no Walter Cronkite that's telling us every single night at 6 o'clock, and that's the way it is. We don't have anyone that has that kind of influence in the world, I don't think. We are no longer a religious country. I don't care what anyone says about America. My mother says when they started opening the grocery stores on Sunday, that was the end of the world as far as Christianity went. But there's some truth to that. Our culture has become highly secularized. What's the fastest growing group of people in terms of the religious landscape of our country? Nuns, you know that. That is the fastest growing demographic. People that have never been churched, never been to a church, and wouldn't know what to do if they stepped in one, and have basically, they don't care if they do or not. It's not part of their lives. Right, inclusiveness and diversity you mentioned before. which we're looking at systemic racism and how it's infiltrated everything we've done. And that has resulted in this country anyway, but it's also been true in Europe for a long time. Polarization, hatred, and bigotry has risen up in new ways that I don't think we could ever imagine 25, 30 years ago. People driving into other people in a demonstration, some of the language, some of the verbiage that's used in our country today, I don't think we could have imagined it 20 years ago, 30 years ago. Really, really damaging to the church is the cult of the individual. The Doobie Brothers were right. Jesus, it's just all right with Jesus and me. That's the way a lot of people look at their religion. If it's all right with me and God, that's all there is I need to worry about. But Christianity is a cruciform religion, right? It's about God and me, but it's about you and me too on that cross piece. And where we all come together is the center of the cross, where we're all in there together. But the cult of the individual is absolutely related to the influence of consumerism. People come to church these days with a transactional kind of attitude. I give you my pledge, maybe. I give you myself in terms of showing up once in a while, and my expectation is that you're going to do whatever I want. I wish I could tell you all the times I've had conversations. I've been a priest for nearly 20 years, where folks will come in and say things to me like, we want to rent your hall. And I'm like, for what? A wedding? Well, it's not a hall, it's a church. Well, we need a venue. And we have this bizarre conversation about the fact that they think we're the Hampton Inn, I think. It's very strange. Or my favorite was the person that said, we want to get married in the church. We don't go to church, but our grandparents were in this church about 1,000 years ago. And by the way, if you do the service, we don't believe in God, so you can't mention God in the service. So we're seeing as, of course I said, you need to go to the Justice of the Peace, and here's the address. But that's basically where we have folks that believe that the church is a provider of services. Or worse, it's just a really nice thing to do on a Sunday when you don't have something else to do. It's a very pleasurable experience, especially when? Christmas and Easter. Right. Some of the other issues that are affecting us are the loss of community. I moved into Kingsport, Tennessee in 1995. And everyone in the neighborhood I moved in came to see me within the first 2 weeks. They all brought me little gifts on things like, a basket of cookies, or somebody gave me a map to the town. Someone offered to take me, to go to the grocery store, those kinds of things. And I was telling my mother that, and she said, wow, it's like it used to be. It's really old-timey there. We used to know our neighbors, right? We used to engage in our neighbors. Maybe you still live in a neighborhood like that. If you do, thanks be to God. But in general, people do not, even the structure of our houses have changed. Big garage in the front of the house, its door comes down, and you have no idea whether someone's there or not. No front porches, the places where people used to gather are missing. We've lost a huge amount of opportunity for community, living very isolated individual lives. Peer pressure, of course, lots of peer pressure from everywhere to how we use our money, to what's fashionable and what's acceptable to do. That's especially true in the younger generations. And the corporate ideal. Our church, whether we like it or not, has operated for a very long time as if we're IBM. I can't tell you how many hours I've spent donating my time, being hired to do strategic planning and developing vision statements and mission statements for churches. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. It's not something I do anymore. But that's from the corporate influence in our lives. We think that's the way to do business. It's not a bad way to do business, but maybe the church needs to do something different than run like IBM. And of course, complacency. A lot of folks don't believe they have the power anymore to do much about anything. And what we forget is all through the Gospels, God and Jesus are choosing the absolute, unexpected individuals, fallible, sinful, strange individuals to do God's work, and they're successful. No one would have asked Peter to be the head of the church. That's just dumb. But in fact, we did. We asked Peter to be the head of church and to watch him. If you want to watch someone really grow in their their ministry, read the book of Acts and watch how Peter changes over that time as he lives into this call. God is choosing people like us all the time to do miraculous things, but we don't necessarily believe that's true any longer. And of course, the speed of change is overwhelming. Just you look at all the announcements we have in our bulletins, all the ways you can click on this and click on that to get more information. We're swimming in an overabundance of information, so it's really hard to figure out to whom do we listen, what is really clear, where is the voice of God in all this communication and the speed of change. Next one. So the other thing I want to talk a lot about that's really impacting the churches dramatically, we saw the curve, right? We saw who's here in the Episcopal Church, is generational differences. I took this great class, I'm almost finished with a doctorate in ministry, and I took this great class where this beautiful, handsome, wonderful young man who was a full professor but also happened to be a Baptist preacher and run his own church, talked about generational differences. I didn't really think that I had, any prejudice against the younger generations, and still we started to talk. And I realized my voice sounded like my grandmother's when I was a teenager about what are those young people up to and what do they think about this. The folks that follow us in that big cluster of folks that are baby boomers, the silent generation, the greatest generation, the folks that follow us have had very different experiences in life. The cultural context they've grown up in are very, very different. And the professor said you need to think about generations like hometowns, like where you're from. And we would never criticize someone from being from New Jersey or South Dakota or wherever they're from. We'd really be interested, what's it like there? What's happening there? But the generational differences of the folks that are coming up behind those of us in that big block of people are very, very different, which calls us to think about how do we reinterpret, how do we repackage, how do we offer the treasure that we have in the church to folks in a way that they can receive it. Very, very different in terms. Most of these generations below us are the first where half of all the marriages in those generations have ended in divorce, where lots of folks don't get married in the church. I don't know, I'll have to ask Greg how many weddings he's done in his time, but maybe I've done 15 or so in the whole time I've been a priest. I've done a lot more funerals. Is that the same for you, Greg?
Yes.
Yeah. So people are not coming to the church for those milestone experiences as they have in the past. So this is something that is a really big issue for the church, and we're not dealing with it. In Southern Pines, where I am, they have almost no young families and children. And we decided to do something really important. We renovated a small building. It's called the Center for Children and Families. And it was a really big deal because it was a sign to folks that we cared about that, where there were no signs of that in a long time. And I asked some people to help me with that project. People who were moms and grandmas in particular wanted them to help with the decorating. And to a person, they said, you have to ask the younger families to do that. It's time for them to step up. And I said, now just which younger families are you referring to? And they had no idea. There were none. There were no families coming to church. That's the generational issue that everyone expects us to do what our forerunners had done, what we did. One other huge issue is the impact of the Enlightenment that happened way back in the 18th and 19th century. The idea, though, is that everything can be known and therefore can be controlled. And that has given way to two really significant things that make life hard for us in the church. One is that every single one of us now carries around inside us an internal expert. I feel it most when I preach, right? Used to be when Greg and I were trained to become priests, we were said, tell them what you're going to say what you're going to say, and then tell them what you said, right? The 3 points. And everybody would nod their heads and say, right on, that's right, there's the gospel. Now, we're preaching to 200 internal experts who have spent exactly 0 time thinking about that topic, but already know more than we know about that. That's the effect of the media that we have, the technology, the idea that everything can be knowable by me. And the other issue is attention span. How what is our average attention span in the United States now? Does anybody know?
30 seconds.
30 seconds, you're right, that's exactly right. The people who are in media are telling us they do not prepare anything longer than that because we're not interested. What's really interesting, if you watch television, my sister and I will watch TV, and an ad will go by and we'll go, she's 3 years younger than me, clearly we're not their demographic because we cannot understand a word they're saying. And have you noticed lately that commercials are ending abruptly before they're finished so the next one can come on? All of a sudden, in the last 3 weeks, I've noticed nobody's finishing a thought on television. Very interesting because attention span is very, very short. Maybe the most, yeah. No, keep going. Keep going. Maybe the worst issue is what Reverend Alan Roxborough, who's an Anglican priest in Canada, who's doing a lot of work around this area of how must the church adapt and recreate itself, talks about modernity's wager, the overwhelming and closely held belief that humanity can actually live without God. The rise of the nuns, the secularization of society has led to the fact, the idea that maybe God is it's just not interesting, just not relevant. Back in 2007, oh, by the way, if you want to read a lot about some really interesting trends in religion, the Pew Research Organization did this huge study called Religion in America, and they have charts and graphs on every denomination and all kinds of issues. Extremely interesting to wander through there and look at that. But they said in 2007, 56% of Americans said that religion was very important in their life, 56%. In 2021, 1 in 5 Americans said that religion is not important to them, it's nothing in particular to them. So that's 20% of the population now that says it's just not important. When I went to seminary in this region, in the southern area, about 48% of people went to church in the Sunday, or at least reported that they did. Does anybody know what this province area, the southern province, what the rate of going to church now is?
Maybe 20%.
Right on the number, 19% right now. So in 20 years, it's fallen that much. And that's just reporting. And you know, like, we all lie on surveys, so you know that's not true. So basically, what we're talking about now in the church is that it's not our Father's Oldsmobile anymore, right? And the biggest issue we have to struggle with in the Episcopal Church, I believe, is what's called our legacy of establishment. Let me just do a quick quiz. How many American presidents have been Episcopalians? Anybody know?
7, 6, 5,
11.
11.
There's a larger number of Episcopalians than any other denomination. We're very proud of saying that statistic. We come from a church that was part of the government, and we have carried that notion that we are the trendsetters in the Episcopal Church. We are the influence makers. We are the top dogs. Episcopalians they speak and people listen to what they have to say. Now, I have to say, I love our bishops. I adore Bishop Sam. He's been very good to me. Bishop Jennifer's great. Love Bishop Ann. And I love it when they're speaking out every time. My sister says every 2 days they speak out on something. But they do speak out on things. And I'm really happy about that because I need to hear what they have to say. But I don't want to tell them, and don't tell them I said this if you see them. Nobody else is listening to them. Nobody else cares what we think. And that's a huge change for us as Episcopalians. We have regarded ourselves as captains and kings. And so our attitude has been, here's our church, it's really good, this is how we do things. Come in and experience it and deal with it because we're not going to change. You have to adapt to our ways. And that's not happening anymore. That's not working anymore. Let me share some statistics. You've heard these before, right? In 2018, the Episcopal Church had about 1.9 baptized members. In 2011, it was the 14th largest denomination. But in 2015, only 1.2% of the adult population would call themselves Episcopalian. You can see it better in the next slide. So you see the numbers. We hit our heyday in 1959, actually, with 3.5 million members. 2019, we're down to 1.8 members. And here's some more recent data. We're still getting our parochial report, but we're down to something like 1.4. And in 2020, now remember, it's a pandemic, so some of this data is skewed by that. But we doubled in the rate of our membership decline in 1 year. We lost 61,000 members, that's a 4% drop. Average Sunday attendance, I don't really know how they measured that in 2020 because it was a nutty year, but it went down by 12%. Weddings decreased by 46%, child baptisms by 67%, adult baptisms by 57%. Let's talk a little bit about Holy Comforter. Have you looked at your data for Holy Comforter recently? So you know back in 2011, how many members did you have back then? Does anybody know off the top of their heads? I looked this up on your chart. About 800 members. Your average Sunday attendance was 370 folks. And you were taking in with plate and pledge about 750,000, right? In 2016, how many members did you have? It's a big year. 1,000 members. Same average Sunday attendance, which I found funny, 370, raising about 900,000 per year in plate and pledge. Last year, in your program report, how many members? 661, right? So big drop. And 150 in average Sunday attendance. And then you're raising, still, plate and pledge good, 845,000. You haven't lost as much there. In case you don't know this, if you go on the Episcopal Church USA website, click on Research and Statistics, you can see a 10-year history of Holy Comforter. And I will say, you've remained steady through the years, pretty much. Big drop, of course, with the pandemic, but really good statistics for you all. So you're kind of bucking the trend a little bit. I'm going to flip through these next ones. You've got the point, right? We're decreasing in numbers, we're decreasing in Sunday attendance, and the trend line is going even deeper into the trough. And I just wanted to show you just a couple of quick graphs and talk about the church as a whole. You can see that we're old. 66% of us are over 50 years of old. 90% of us are white, that's right. 60% of us are married, but there are some really interesting trends in the population. The divorced population and single population are the two fastest growing demographics in our country. While we were sleeping, I think all this stuff has happened, and it's time for us to sort of wake up and pay attention, even though it may not be as dire as it looks. So I want to say, like I've said, I've spent a lot of time in my life helping churches develop vision and mission statements and strategic goals, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I realized that what I was doing was falling prey to that enlightenment idea that I might know, or that we might know what our mission is. And I've shifted my thinking into what's called a more missional theology, which is the idea that God has a mission. That's the only mission we should be talking about. And that our job is to jump onto that mission, given where we are, who we are, and what we're already about. So God has a mission, and we're called to join in the ongoing work. God is already ahead of us in the neighborhoods where we exist. And our task is to follow where God is leading versus think we can direct and articulate our own mission. What's interesting about this to me is that if you think about the example of Jesus, when he was baptized, what's the first thing he did? He went to the desert, he prepared himself, he meditated, he spent time alone in retreat, got tempted by the devil. It wasn't totally such a fun time. But when he came out, what did he do? He did not hole up in the synagogue and say, I'll have office hours from 1 to 3, y'all come when you need to. He went out. He walked around. And the Word was made flesh and started walking around the neighborhood. And that's the question I want to pose to you all today as you begin to think about where God might be inviting you into the future. And it's going to, I'm going to ask you to shift in your thinking to this idea that God, we used to think that God was in the church, right? If you're going to find God, you have to come to church, you have to become a member, you have to, show up for potlucks and be on the vestry and be a lector. Instead, the missional view says the church is already in God, and God is already way ahead of us. The missional theology says, for some reason, you all have been placed here at Holy Comforter in 2023 on, this is a park, right, that you're on, Park Drive, and that is a reason for that. Bishop Wright, who was a new bishop in Atlanta when I was there, and also a good buddy of mine, talked to all of us rectors the first year he was bishop. He said this to everyone, and he said, I want you to think about where you are and draw 3 circles around your church. 1 mile, 3 mile, 5 mile. And I want you to ask yourselves, who lives there? What do they like? What are they interested in? What do they need? What is God asking us to do to the neighbors that God has given us immediately, so close we can touch them? Quick question, how many of you drove in from somewhere else to go to church here today? Most of the rest of you live in this neighborhood? Or no? Right. Very different, right? Automobile has made a big difference in our lives. But God has, for some reason, has placed you right here. And there's work for you to do in the neighborhood. And this led a bunch of us to do some crazy things, like spend a year just walking around the neighborhood. Walking around the neighborhood at different times of the day and night, seeing who was there, what were they like, what are they interested in, having little chit-chats here and there, and asking ourselves, who are these folks and what might the church do for them or be for them? One of my colleagues, she's in Minnesota, and they live in this beautiful, their church is in this beautiful suburban neighborhood filled with gorgeous, huge, big houses, lovely, lovely homes. And they found out when they started walking around the neighborhood that most of those homes were filled with widows. And they were house poor, right? So they had these big homes, they were living on a little bit of a pension, Social Security, they didn't have enough money to care for their property, and they noticed things like the garage doors weren't painted and the grass wasn't cut all the time, and there were little problems like that, mail collected outside. And so a bunch of folks in the church just decided to introduce themselves to the neighbors and say, hey, we're your neighbors at St. Matthew's, and is there anything we can do for you as neighbors? They weren't there to say, come and join our church. They weren't there to say, make a pledge. They were there to say, we're your neighbors, and we noticed. And suddenly stuff started happening, like the dads who mowed their grass at their house would then take their kids and mow a couple of lawns around in these areas. A couple of fences got fixed up. And people began to get to know each other. So when they brought the kids over to paint the wall of the fence, the woman of the house provided some cookies or iced tea and lemonade, and there started to be relationship. Sometimes these folks would come for special events at the church, but hardly any of them became members. But they knew that they had neighbors in the community, and that's what they believed God was asking them to do, and that sort of thing grew and grew and grew. Another priest, he's a young guy, he played basketball. He loved to play basketball, and he would go out in the parking lot where there's a basketball hoop, and he started shooting hoops. His church was primarily Hispanic folk, but it was on the edge of town where there was lots of Asian folks, and there had been a long-term conflict between Asian teenagers and Hispanic teenagers. And he was out there playing basketball, and he noticed all these kids were sort of hanging around watching him. They were Asian kids, they weren't from his parish. He said, hey, you want to play basketball? So they started playing basketball. And then suddenly some kids from the church who never came to church, the youth there, said, hey, we want to play basketball too. And suddenly you had this mixed group of kids, Asian Hispanics playing basketball. And so the priest said, hey, he asked the Guadalupanas, that's the women's group in that church, the women that follow Our Lady of Guadalupe, would they make a little snack and some drinks for the kids? And they started interacting with these kids, and it grew into these kids formed a league. The church raised money for the uniforms. None of those kids were their kids. They were just kids from the neighborhood, and they ended up supporting them like boosters. They were boosters. And they began, in fact, about 3 or 4 of those kids every year started coming to church. and a couple of them were confirmed, and a relationship began. These are the kinds of things that folks are trying out, small experiments, trying to answer that question, where is God leading us in the future, and who does God want us to serve? So all of this new life we're in, all of these changes, calls us to live, work, pray, and play differently. So how can we do that? We don't know. That's the truth, right? I'd like to say, well, here's your answer, friends. Just follow Pat Grace's 5-step program and you will be the most successful church in the universe. No, it has something to do about walking around the neighborhood, about doing some small experiments, flip to the next slide, and doing some things that we're not used to doing as Episcopalians. Outreach is something I know you people love to do here and have a long history of doing it, and I believe you do it in a really good way. I believe you do it in partnership with other groups, but a lot of times outreach is us great white hopes, right? Coming into a community and saying, here's what you need, and we're going to give it to you whether you want it or not, right? This is a whole different way of thinking about outreach, about Bible study, about all these things that's involved listening and looking without knowing it all and doing all the talking. Listening, big deal. What do the people in our neighborhoods think about? What's important to them? What are they worried about? What brings them joy? Praying versus planning. One of the things our parishes did in the Atlanta Diocese was simply walk around the neighborhood and pray for whoever they saw and prayed for whatever they could understand was going on in the community. And things started to happen. People started, one of these places was Holy Trinity where I served, and in the pandemic, this is a church with a long history of outreach, but it had deadened. It was not very vital when I got there. And one of the things, there's a church in East Greensboro that's in a food desert. A lot of the people that live there are new citizens of our country. A lot of them are poor. A lot of them lost their jobs in the pandemic. And so there was a call for us to provide food. So folks, we couldn't have contact, but we had these 2 big porches, and people brought bags and bags and bags of food. And then some teams went out, and at first in the pandemic, right, they left the bag of groceries on the step, they waved to the person behind the door, behind the mask, and over time then they began to know each other. And soon, when they dropped the bag off, they would get a bag in return of something, some kind of like, this one woman made the most beautiful pair of shawls for all the people that delivered the food. And that grew into relationships. Again, going out instead of saying, y'all should come in here and get your food back from us. They took it out to these folks. So praying versus planning. They prayed about it, something came for them. Approaching folks with curiosity versus judgment. Asking the questions, what is the world like for you? What is life, what is God like for you? Versus presuming that we know. Redefining what success is. That's hard for us, y'all. Hard for Episcopalians, right? We're very much into that Protestant work ethic, even though we're also Catholic, even though we're Protestants. And it means we have to look at things over the long haul versus short-term fixes. A lot of times churches feel pressured to serve every group that's in the community and do something for everyone. What we're finding is deeper relationships with 1 or 2 groups over time is really much more beneficial to everyone, including us. So this brings us to the critical importance of innovation, right? Trying some things and seeing what happens. And that means we have to become more comfortable with mistakes. So often in our life, failure, if we work it, can lead to something really amazing. And that's what we have to become way more comfortable with in the church, trying stuff. And if it doesn't work, saying we're not doing that again, but maybe we learned something in that experience that we can do the next time differently. And becoming a learning organization versus one that lists all of our achievements. What would be great if your annual report next year said, these are the 10 things we learned this year. And they were hard to learn, but we learned them. And then rinse and repeat. Keep doing it. So it's a whole different way of thinking, and none of this is geared toward bringing members into the church. But what ends up happening when churches start to do this, what happens? People start to come. It's like Field of Dreams. If you build it, they'll come. But what we do want, I don't know if you can read the punchline on this, but we want to ask God where to go, but we're hoping that God will lead us on a journey of transformation without requiring any real changes. That's us, right? That's human beings. I want to leave you with this thought from Thomas Merton, that we don't need to know precisely what is happening or exactly where it's all going. What we need is to recognize the possibilities and the challenges offered by the present moment, and to embrace them with courage, faith, and hope.